This episode is brought to you by our friends at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. CBTS exists to provide ministerial training in the context of a confessional local church. They are, among other things, confessional, Baptist, affordable, and accessible. They are also now fully accredited by the Association of Reformed Theological Seminaries. You can learn more about them at their website, which is cbtseminary.org. Again, that is cbtseminary.org.
The Covenant Podcast exists to discuss doctrine, theology, and the biblical worldview from a covenantal Baptist perspective. We pray that this resource will be edifying to you and glorifying to the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, let's get started. Welcome to the Covenant Podcast today. We are very excited and pleased to have the opportunity to welcome Dr. Michael Haykin onto the Covenant Podcast. Dr. Haykin was born in England of Irish and Kurdish parents. Michael Haykin serves as the professor of church history and biblical spirituality at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Haykin has a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Toronto, a Master of Religion from Wycliffe College, the University of Toronto, and a Th.D. in Church History from Wycliffe College and the University of Toronto. Michael Haykin and his wife, Alison, have two grown children, Victoria and Nigel. Dr. Haykin, we want to welcome you to the podcast today.
Yeah, it's great being with you.
I'll start us off with a question related to an article that you wrote, I believe in 2007. In an article that you wrote for 9 Marks, you say that our culture, I'm guessing you mean Western culture, is not one that provides encouragement for the nurture and development of deep, long-lasting, and satisfying friendships. What are some reasons for this, you think?
Yeah, I think part of it is one of the dominant features of our culture, and this goes back well into the Middle Ages. It's the late Middle Ages that you see this arise. Is the individualism that marks our culture. We have, in recent years, probably the last century or so, this has become almost a kind of the dominant hallmark in some respects from a sociological standpoint of our culture, and the focus on the person as an individual over against a person as a member of a community, I think has fostered this to many degrees. The busyness of Western life, technology, amazingly, social media, I don't think has been helpful here. The whole area of Facebook friends, many of whom you don't really know. People are obviously interested in you for whatever reason, but they're not the sort of friendships that are you would want to think about in terms of classical reflection on friendship. I'm thinking here of Plato's Symposium or Aristotle's discussion of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics. And so there are a number of factors. There's not just one factor, but there are a number of factors that make developing really satisfying, solid friendships in Western culture a reality.
Dr. Haykin, is the Western Church doing much better at fostering friendships?
No, I don't think so. I think that I think this is an element in which we have been shaped probably unknowingly by our culture. I think part of the problem for Christians is that unless they are intentionally building a New Testament culture in the life of their churches, and certainly the strength of earlier generations of Christians in terms of their commitment to one another, their building of friendships. Unless you're purposely nurturing a New Testament culture, you'll end up going back to your default culture. And in this case, it's obviously Western culture. And I don't think churches, by and large, are succeeding in this area any better than our culture, although we technically should have the resources to do so.
Dr. Haykin, how would you define friendship, or what is friendship? What should we be seeking after?
Well, I think friendship, I would probably take a biblical model, and in the scriptures, in the Old Testament, you actually find two kind of definitions that are really kind of tucked away in somewhat obscure passages. One is found in Deuteronomy, where it talks about if you are tempted to idolatry by a relative, by a father, mother, brother, and then it says a friend who is as your own soul. And it goes on to have the radical solution that you must kill such a person. So it's not a text that you would normally associate with friendship, but it's that little statement there that what is a friend? A friend is somebody who is as your own soul. And the original Hebrew gives the impression there of somebody who is knit to your soul. Actually, that's the word that is used. And that kind of phrase is brought up again in 1 Samuel to talk about the friendship between David and Jonathan, that Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And here we find friendship really kind of being defined as a bonding, a sharing of similar concerns, and so on. And then the other passage is found in Exodus, where it says that God would come and speak to Moses face to face as a friend to a friend. And here, again, you've got a passage that is not designed to explicate friendship, but again, it's a throwaway statement, as it were. It's an implication. And that friendship there is a significant degree of transparency. Friendship is a relationship where one can be honest with one another. It's not only that you're bonded together emotionally in terms of sharing, as it were, one heart, but there is this truthfulness and honesty that is the kind of ambience or matrix or ground in which friendship is nourished. So those two passages, not per se definitions of friendship, but they are implications of, or they imply, they assume the reader knows what a friend is in light of these texts.
Well, thank you for that. You answered our next question, so we'll just go ahead and move on to the next one that we have. We have discussed Andrew Fuller and William Carey on our podcast, and as our listeners are starting to become familiar with, these men were instrumental in the formation of the Baptist Mission Society in the late 18th century. Dr. Haykin, can you give us some historical background for the founding of the Union and describe the men and their friendships that led to this?
Yeah, it really grows out of, in some ways, the evangelical awakening. You have the evangelical revivals in the middle of the 18th century, actually the third decade and fourth decade of the 18th century. They're transatlantic. They're impacted both sides of the Atlantic, both Britain and America. They are primarily located in the Anglophone world, and whenever there is revival, there is concern for the salvation of others. And it's not surprising that as the revival does impact particular Baptists, in particular there is a denominator of the denomination that we call Calvinistic Baptists. Some might call Reformed Baptists today. That's not a word that is used at that period. You start to get the awareness that there are vast amounts of humanity that have no access to gospel, to scripture, to ministers of the gospel. And the emergence of missionary concern is part of this awakening through the 18th century, but it's also particularly germane in the particular Baptist context, because far too many of the English particular Baptist communities are deeply hampered or even in bondage to a hyper Calvinism, as we might describe it today. I would probably prefer to describe it as a high Calvinism, where the decrees of salvation were so emphasized that the human decision to follow Christ was almost lost completely. And in certain circles, and it was the circle that Andrew Fuller grew up in, ministers would never plead with the lost to come to Christ, because doing so was felt to be an affront to God, because only God can awaken sinners, which is a biblical truth. But there is also the parallel truth that men and women are called upon. They are urged to respond to the gospel, even though they cannot. And there's a paradox here, but no more a problematic paradox than the Trinity or the Incarnation, etc. And so it's as these churches are beginning to be impacted by the awakening, also dealing with their own particular context of this hyper-Calvinism, that you find the makings of what would eventually become the modern missionary movement, and the emergence initially of the Baptist Missionary Society in 1792.
Could you flesh out the nature of the friendships of some of those men that were instrumental in forming that society?
Yeah, this is a factor, for instance, that is often not considered. So that when, there's been a lot written, understandably, on the formation of the Modern Missionary Society, William Carey as a pioneer, and Andrew Fuller's theology. Fuller actually writes a book called The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, which is published in 1785. And it's on the basis of that book in which he basically argues that ministers of the gospel have a duty before God to urge the lost in a variety of ways to come to faith in Christ. And usually the studies that have been done, and there's been a lot done comparatively, deal with those sorts of issues. They deal with the theological issues, they deal with the ecclesiological issues, but the kind of personal issues, namely the friendship between these men, has been frequently overlooked. And I suspect this again is a symptom of our cultural malaise that I was talking about earlier, the failure of both the Western culture and the Western church to address or see friendship as a theological issue. But it is the friendship between these men, the bonds of love between Fuller and Carey, and then a circle of men in Britain, John Ryland Jr., who was at a Baptist church in Northampton and then became the principal of Bristol Baptist College. John Sutcliffe, who is in Olney Baptist Church for about 40 years. Olney in Buckinghamshire is where John Newton had his first pastorate. In fact, Newton's pastorate overlaps Sutcliffe's time in the Baptist church there for a number of years. Samuel Pierce at Cannon Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And there are deep bonds that are formed between these men, well illustrated, for example, by a Greek New Testament that Pierce gave to Carey in India. He actually sent it to Carey in India, and he inscribed in the front of it that passage from the book of Acts, one heart and one soul. And that's all he wrote. He wrote them in Greek, and that book still exists. I've seen it in an archival deposit in Regent's Park College in Oxford, Oxford University. And that really kind of captures these men, that for a period of time, God gave these men such a love for one another that they did sense that they were experiencing the sort of New Testament reality that you find in the early chapters of Acts. And that's a key factor in the formation of the modern missionary movement, that it grows out of these kind of bonds of friendship. And I think what it does is it reflects a much larger truth, which is that whenever there has been a great work of God in the history of the church, he does it through a circle of friends. It's never just one man. I mean, we have, again, I think it is a symptom of our culture that we tend to focus on Luther, Carey, Athanasius, etc. But the reality is that these men, in the achievements that they did for the gospel, for the kingdom, and etc., it was done in a circle of friends. A number of years ago, a book was published called The Friends of Calvin, and 30 chapters, 30 friends. And to be honest, I only knew about maybe half a dozen of them. And it just brings home the reality that not simply Calvin's work in Geneva, but all great works of God are grounded in the circle of friends. And if you want a biblical example, you just have to think of the Pauline circle, the circle of friends around the Apostle Paul.
What you kind of alluded to this in one of your earlier answers about the idea of being intentional about cultivating a New Testament church, or the identity of the New Testament church that we find within the Bible. What are some foundational beliefs and habits that we as Christians must retrieve if we are to cultivate the priority of forming these meaningful friendships?
Well, I think one of them is an important one, which also is a problem in Western culture, and that is the use of time. And friendships take time, and you just can't. I mean, the sort of social media where you have an instantaneity, which marks social media, that's not going to cut it for friendship. There needs to be that face-to-face time. Obviously, other media can help in this regard. We have the various social media, which previous generations did not have. They were restricted to letters. But it's still going to take time. And to sit down and write a letter, a handwritten letter, or to sit down with somebody, there's going to be time taken. And this has to be intentional. And I'm sure if we would ask all of our hearers, are there people who once were friends in your life and you have no idea where they are now? And that not because you had a formal break, that there was any sort of blow up, but simply because you didn't have the time to continue to nurture that friendship. And I'm pretty certain that probably most of us could think of somebody who was once a friend, a close friend, and we've just lost touch simply because of the busyness of life. I mean, obviously that happens. It's not in itself a sin in one sense, but I think it does point that what we have to recover is a sense of the preciousness of time and the importance of decisions that we make as to how to allocate time. And the decision to spend time with friends, doing certain things, or simply sitting and chatting, making sure that we meet such and such a person every month, or once every few months, or what have you. Keeping in touch when we don't see them face to face by email or by phone calls. That's going to take time. And busyness of life, particularly, in our context, families, church, our vocations, all of these are really kind of, unless we are intentional again about spending time, committing time, these can be enemies to the whole area of friendship. So I think that's one area. I think a second area would be we need to have some explicit teaching about the importance of friendship. We need to know why friends are important, and etc. So there is growing. This wasn't the case about 20 years ago, because I think I probably first started thinking about this probably the best part of 30 years ago, and began to try to find 20th century resources on friendship, and there was a paucity of them. There are very few of them, and this has changed, or is changing. There are increasingly studies of friendship, both at an academic and at a popular level, and but I'm not sure it's necessarily trickled down into the local church. And in fact, I think this is one of the challenges: how do local churches go about fostering friendship? And it certainly cannot be, in some ways, artificial thing that some churches do at the beginning of their services. Say hello to one or two people you've never met before, at the beginning of a service, which is kind of a Protestantized version of the Roman Catholic sharing the peace, which does in its origins go back to a holy kiss of the New Testament. But churches need to talk about this subject and why friendship is important. So there's a couple of areas. One is the taking stock of the value of time and decisions we make, where we commit our time. And the other is that churches have to be intentional about thinking and try to cultivate friendships.
Our last question and this question have some overlap, and obviously we would all probably agree that many pastors battle loneliness in ministry, and maybe have a difficult time developing friendships sometimes with others that are going through experiences that they are going through. So what actions can a pastor take to ensure that he and his family develop good quality friendships?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's probably one of the real challenges in our communities, is that pastoral friendships. The pastor, as a leader within the local church, stands in a somewhat different position than the other members of the church in developing friendships within a congregation. Some of the wisdom or received wisdom of the past would emphasize that a pastor cannot have friends within his own congregation. The seminary that I first began teaching at in Toronto, Central Baptist Seminary, back in the 1980s, its founder was a man named W. Gordon Brown, who was actually the translator of the Book of John in the New International Version. Very gifted Greek scholar, very remarkable leader. But in his pastoral theology class, he would tell students, you should not have friends within your local church. And so I think I don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. But I do think that that advice didn't just come out of thin air. I think there were reasons for that. And I think part of it is the danger of being perceived to have favorites within the local church, and how that might be a hindrance to ministry. I think, and this is where, again, technology is defeating us. In the past, one of the places that you would develop friendships as a pastor would be when you went to seminary or Bible college. You would build relationships. I have two friends. This now goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, when I was in the seminary, that I maintained friendships with, and they're my oldest friends. And they were both, men that I studied with at seminary. But with the onset of online theological education and the fact that you can do a degree totally online, you never get to meet any of your fellow students. And this is a problem. And so this is one area that pastors will develop friendships. And one of the reasons why I'm not against online education in a complete sense. I think there is value in it as a supplement, but I still am very strongly convinced that a residential model supplemented by maybe online is enormously helpful. And I've seen it at Southern, where I teach, particularly in the doctoral program, where we have had a very strong emphasis on a residential program for at least 2.5 years, and then students, once they're writing their thesis, don't need to be residential. And the friendships that develop there, and that they're renewed at conferences and various other contexts. And so that is certainly a very important kind of venue for developing friendships for pastors. But I do think pastoral ministry can be very, very lonely. And it's vital for pastors to have friends. And some of them, I think, can be built within the local church, as long as it's very, very clear that in building such friendships, the pastor is not trying to develop, favorites within the local church, as it were. And that his friendship with such an individual does not mean that a person is favored above others in an unhealthy sense. And again, a pastor has enormous pressures on time, despite all the labor-saving devices we have in our culture. And he needs to cultivate the sort of things that we've been talking about, the habits that enable him to sustain long-term friendships.
This next question is kind of a spin on the one before it, but what can churches do to ensure that their pastors and their families develop the friendships that we've been talking about?
Well, I think those in leadership alongside the pastor, deacons, other elders, need to ask the pastor some hard questions. I think when they call a man, are there people in your life with whom you can be transparent and honest, who can hold you accountable? Do you pray with others? Those sort of questions are never asked, I think, when a man is called to ministry. But I think those are questions that need to be asked. And then I think as a man meets with friends, I think the church needs to recognize that he'll need time to do this, and sometimes that time might mean a weekend away. I have a friend, a good friend, a close friend in Quebec, and he's a pastor, and he has two very close friends in pastoral ministry. Well, one of them now is the head of a seminary in Quebec, and they meet twice a year for a 3 or 4 day retreat where they pray together, laugh together, eat together, etc., share their lives together. And that's obviously going to take a block of time, and their families and their churches are committed to them having this time. And so churches need to ask pastors, are there friends in your life whom you need to meet like that? Maybe it's only once a year for a couple of days. But the churches need to understand the vital importance of this and help the pastor have time, to carve out time, etc. And maybe elders and deacons need to ask those hard questions. Pastor, do you have time in your life for friendships? Do you have friends? And how are you keeping up those friendships? Just as much as are you walking with God? What's your prayer life like? Are there areas of challenge in your spiritual life, etc.? And the one we see, the latter, as absolutely vital, having God as our friend. But the other is as important.
Dr. Haykin, this will be our last question that we have, unless Jimmy wants to add another one. Do you have any other words of encouragement for our listeners related to friendship?
Yes, I think it is this, that moving forward, unless we experience continent-wide revival in North America, I think we as Christians face challenging times ahead. And the sort of challenges that other Christian communities faced around the world and have faced in the past, we've not known, because broadly speaking, the culture that we that is part of our life, namely a kind of broadly speaking Judeo-Christian culture, has been the culture of the West. Western culture has been, broadly speaking, a Judeo-Christian culture, which explains one of the reasons why intellectual elites in media and universities and in politics are so disdainful of Western culture, because it has been, if they're not Christians, it has been so imbued with Christianity, and in their determination to rid themselves of that background, really it's resulted in an attack on Western culture. And I think unless things change significantly for many communities in North America, for Christian communities, I think going forward, we will need each other. And I think one of the reasons why you find those friendships being so powerful for Baptists in England in the late 18th century is that Baptists were marginalized. They were a marginal group. And these Christian brothers and sisters who believed in congregational church government, believers' baptism, rejected the idea of a state church and infant baptism, they recognized that there were, to some degree, their larger culture was inimical to them, and they needed each other. And I think this is not this is an option in the Christian life. This is a nice frill. If I've got time, I'll have friends. No, we are going to need each other. Increasingly in a world that is hostile to who we are and what we love and what we are pursuing. And so I don't think that this is something, well, we can engage in friendship if we have some time. No, we need to make time, and we need to do it now. Going forward, we will desperately need each other in the Christian life.
Dr. Haykin, thank you so much for coming on the Covenant podcast with us.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you very, very much for having me, and every blessing.
And this episode is brought to you by our friends at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. CBTS exists to provide ministerial training in the context of a confessional local church. They are, among other things, confessional, Baptist, affordable, accessible, and accredited. You can learn more about them at cbtseminary.org. Again, that's cbtseminary.org.
Thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. If you've enjoyed this resource, or you simply like the Covenant Podcast, head on over to our iTunes page, subscribe, and leave us a review. We are also available via Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, and Podbean. Thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. Grace and peace to you.